Hello everybody, welcome back to Jinx's Building Guide, the next installation. Today we will be talking color. Behind me you can see the facades of what makes up the apartment complex of doom, despair, and be landlords, probably. We're gonna spice these facades up today by using color in different ways, and I'm gonna try to explain the process of how I go about coloring builds to make them less doomy, despairy-y, I don't know if that's a word, and potentially having better landlords. I don't know. I'm not sure that has anything to do with this, but anyway, let's get into it. I know you. I know this is your favorite block palette. It has all the blocks that you like to use. Stone, brick, oak wood, quartz, everyone's favorite blocks. But I'm gonna be honest, it's boring. It's not good. It's not great. I don't like it. I think we can make it more interesting by using color to make it more colorful. As you can see, I have duplicated this thing 3 times, so there are 4 terrible facades, and we'll be using these 3 to kind of vary up the color and make them more interesting in different ways. Hopefully by the end we can see the difference and compare different strategies to coloring builds and to kind of give you an idea of the different results that just changing the color can have on an overall build. Because build's aesthetics can change quite a lot just by using color. I'm going to not change any of the detail or anything like that, just color and texture, kinda. I mean, those two things are a bit related, but mostly we're going to be focusing on color today, and you'll be able to see that it really does make a huge difference. For the sake of this tutorial kind of video, I've already laid out the builds, and I've already done the detailing and everything. Typically, I would pick out colors and things before I even start the build. That would take place during the step where I build out build palettes, which look something like this, block palettes. Or maybe even after I finish wireframing, I might decide to change some colors. Typically, you don't want to make an entire build and then change the color. This is just for visuals. But block palettes like this are going to be an important first step. So let's kind of talk about them. This block palette is, honestly, I don't even know what these were for. And they're gone. Good. This is a block palette. It goes to this build right here, as you can see. Basically what they are is just a collection of blocks that I like to place down before I start on the build to get an idea of the colors and textures that I'm going to be using for the build. It's just a thing to help visually, so I kind of know what all the blocks look like together before I put them all into the build. There's a number of different ways you can set them up. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. This one I kind of separated the roof textures on top and put it on top of the wall textures down here. So this one back here is just a gradient from top to bottom so that I could tell which colors would work in the gradient I used for this build. But again, it doesn't really matter how you set it up. Ultimately, it's just a visual indicator of what the build is going to look like. So for example, if I were going to be showing the block palette for the build I have up here, you can see that the bottom is mostly made up of stone bricks with oak logs complementing it and quartz and then black stone on top. And this is kind of an example of what a build palette for this build might look like. And you may notice that there's not much going on here. There's only 4 blocks in this build palette. It's really not much. And that could be the reason the build looks kind of boring. It's not terrible, but when you compare it to the block palettes of other builds, you can see how many more blocks are being used, which is partially why the builds look much more interesting and why the textures are so much better and stuff like that. Now, this block palette right here definitely creates more interest than the last one did, and the main difference is that there's way more blocks. Now, the first facade that we're going to vary up, I kind of want to show that when I say we're working with color, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be all bright and vibrant color like this yellow build over here. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to make the walls yellow, you don't have to make them green or whatever. You can still make the walls gray. That's totally fine. Whenever you're building a building, you're usually building it out of a material of some kind. This should seem obvious, but it's definitely helpful when we're picking out blocks to make a build more interesting looking. This build right here is made out of stone bricks, and I kind of like that actually for this first one, so we're going to keep it. A lot of the building being made of stone is fine, but when we use the same block over and over again, that's all the exact same color and texture, it gets relatively boring relatively quickly. So down here on this first row, I have the new blocks we will be using for the wall, and it's all completely grayscale. Actually, most of the build is white and gray blocks. There's a lot of different blocks to work with in grayscale, actually. You can see over here, this kind of grayscale gradient that I made goes all the way from black to white, and it's a pretty smooth gradient, which just goes to show you that there are a lot of different options for shades of gray blocks that you can use. So you don't have to build out of all one flat color. You can find a lot of different blocks to work with, and I've set up a bit of a gradient right here. This gradient just goes from a bit of a darker to a lighter color, as they tend to do, and also a bit of a green down here. We've thrown some moss in near the bottom, and if you step back again, you can just see how it goes from dark to light. Ignore these two blocks right here, I'll come back to those, but whenever you're trying to build a gradient or some kind of block palette like this, regardless of the color, could be gray, could be some other color, it's pretty easy to do with gray because there are so many different options. One of the good strategies to making the color more interesting is varying up the color. So gray is a fine color to use. You could just use some lighter grays, some darker grays, some greener grays, whatever. Since I like the idea of this building being made out of stone down here, I want to use grays that are stone. That doesn't mean every block has to be stone. You can see there's wool in there, but it looks like stone if you put it next to all these other stone blocks. It's gray. When I go to texture this wall here, I'm going to use all the gray blocks I've picked out in my block palette. This is a good reason why you should use a block palette here. I'm going to start from the bottom where I'm going to use the darker blocks and work my way up where I'm going to use the lighter blocks. I'm mostly going to go in order. I'll mix it up a little bit randomly as I go. But again, I'm mostly just going to be going in order from dark to light. And just like that, isn't this looking so much better now? Really? I didn't do too much with it other than texture with the blocks we picked out earlier. The colors are the same. We just have light gray up here to dark green, dark gray down there. And then I did the exact same thing with the white. It gets dark from the diorite and works its way up to the brightest, which is wool, using this gradient I built right here. And this is kind of what I mean by texturing and color go hand in hand, especially with the way I like to texture. I don't necessarily pick blocks out for the texture that they are, but rather for their color, and then I put a bunch of blocks, and I can talk more about this in a texturing video, but all these stone blocks, the texture doesn't really matter much. Like, it's clearly supposed to be made of stone. Stone brick is the main block. The rest of these blocks, mainly I picked them out for their color, and you can see I do this on a lot of other builds. This one kind of, for example, this one might be a bad example because there's a lot going on there. This one, for example, again, is supposed to be another kind of stone brick, similar texture to this, I guess, similar material anyway, but you can see all the different blocks that are being used in here. There's wood, there's whatever this basalt, whatever that stuff is called, basalt. I think that's called basalt. And so, as I said, they kind of go hand in hand, and so as you can see, that a lot of this texturing is kind of coloring. I just colored this bottom part darker and then went brighter as I go, and I mixed it up so it's a little bit random, and that's all texturing is at the end of the day too. So while I can make another video talking about texturing, color and texture are more or less the same thing. However, this build is still looking a little bland, all things considered. I mean, I did make the white and gray slightly more interesting versions of white and gray, but I want to leave grayscale behind and start talking about the second, and I think maybe the most important aspect or version of coloring. Accent coloring is especially important when you have a build that's mostly made up of one color or two colors, kind of like this, how this is mostly just grayscale. It's white and it's gray, not very vibrant colors. In order to make the build stand out a bit more from the complete grayscale color palette, you actually want to use accent colors a little bit, and so I have a few picked out down here already. All an accent color is it's small parts of a build being changed to very contrasting colors to stand out much more, like an accent on the build. So for example, this awning up here, if I just want to change it to a white and red striped awning by using these not crimson, what are these called? Mangrove trapdoors, whatever, the red ones. And you can see that this just brings a pop of color to the build and kind of makes it interesting immediately. Now your eye is immediately drawn to the awning, and it just gives you a very nice contrasting bit of color to look at. If I wanted to make it even more of a strong accent, I could change the white to blue, and since there's no blue anywhere else on this build right now anyway, the blue stands out as well, and so now you can see how much more the awning stands out and how much it draws your attention. And little bits of attention-grabbing, bright color like this is very important. I've also been replacing a lot of the wood on this build with spruce, not just because spruce is objectively the superior wood, but also because it does give us a little bit more variance, and variance on color is important. So now I'm mainly using this oak wood as a bit more of an accent wood, like in the windows or the railing or whatever is covering up these plant boxes here on the bottom. This isn't really an accent color. It's similar to varying up the colors or shades of gray and white that we had earlier, but it does just help to add a little bit more interest to the build. Speaking of accent colors, this flower bed's another way to add some. As you can see on this build, they're all basically just green. I have green plant, green plant, green plant with some brown green plant. And over here, you can just add some nice colorful flowers. It, again, just very attention-grabbing, bright color to contrast with the grayscale, toned-back colors I'm using for the rest of the build. I potentially want to add just a little bit more subtle versions of this concept by adding a little bit of this colored terracotta blocks to the build here. And you can see, again, a little bit of attention-grabbing color. It blends pretty well with the gray, but it's not gray. So it kind of works as a way to grab your attention, very similar to the awning, and add a bit of an accent to the gray color itself. You can just add that in a couple of places, and you can see how it draws your attention to those places as well. And the build just slowly gets more interesting the more small accent colors we add to it. Similar concept up on the roof. I've decided I want to add some blue into this roof for no real reason other than I think it might look kind of interesting, because this actually makes no practical sense that the build would have random blue in the roof, but you know, this is Minecraft, so we can have fun and do whatever we feel like doing. Just gonna blend it in with some slightly lighter colored blocks right here. And you can see how much attention that draws to the roof. I think this would work better on a larger scale, but I'm okay with it. I think it looks good. And with that, I think we can call this first build good. I just used grayscale and accent coloring techniques on the build, which are kind of like the two most simple ones, I guess. There's not much like color theory or anything involved in those. Not that I'm going to dive really far into that in this video anyway. But it's just, I mean, simple ways that you can texture that make the build way more interesting to look at if you compare it to the building on either side at the moment. There's so much for your eye to be drawn to, and it just makes the build way more interesting. Alright, we've talked about grayscale, and we've talked about accent colors. Now I want to talk about cool versus warm colors. I'm going to take you all for a moment to middle school art class, where here you can see we have a color wheel. Again, I'm not really getting into color theory here, but I mean, as you can see, this diagram is doing all the work for me. Hot colors on one side, cool colors on the other side. And this is a nice diagram to show that any warm color palette will contrast nicely with a cool color palette. If you make most of a build out of a warm color palette, then accents will look really good if they're cool colors in general. Also, colors that are directly across from each other on the wheel are complementary colors, and they work extremely well together. So you can see blue and orange work great together, red and green, and purple and yellow also will look really good together. But generally speaking, warm colors contrast well with cool colors, and when they're all put together, they look good together also. So if you want to make a wall out of warm colors, you can use oranges and reds and then complement it with like purple and green. That would look pretty good. If you make a build out of largely warm colors like yellow or something and then try and contrast it with orange or red, it's not going to look as good because the colors that you're using as accent colors are just not going to contrast enough to really draw the attention that they want to draw. Of course, all this is irrelevant when you're working on like a grayscale color palette, because gray doesn't really exist anywhere on the cool or warm spectrum, and so you can use whatever color you want as an accent color. But when you build a wall out of one certain kind of color, like orange, then using red, not going to accent very well. You want to use a cool color like blue or green. That will accent much better. It was at this point in time that my recording broke and the visuals completely froze, so it was just me yapping over the pause screen exactly like this for like half an hour or however long it took me to record all the rest of the clips I was going to use in this video. But unfortunately, the builds are already done, as you can see behind me, so there's a sneak peek. Not that it matters, because you can see them in the thumbnail anyway. However, this does mean that I can't build and talk as I go, which I was intending to do, but it should be fine. I'm going to talk about the rest of the things I was going to talk about anyway, but in case you're wondering why the format of this video has changed, it's because all of my recording broke. And also, this is a good time for me to complain. Stupid OBS, stupid. So anyway, to put into Minecraft what I was talking about with the color wheel earlier, you can see I have this color palette here, which I'm going to be using, or well, I technically already have, but whatever, that I'm going to use, or that I have used on this build right there. So the bottom layer of the build is going to be made up of this color palette right here, which is just kind of tan colors, which technically fall on the warm side of the wheel, but they're very toned back and kind of desaturated compared to other warm colors like the orange up here, for example. So I'm going to be using that for the base of the building right here, this stone section. I'm going to replace it with this kind of tan color palette. It's supposed to represent just like, I don't know, the sandstone or just light tan brick, whatever you want to see. There's also wood thrown in there, and this kind of goes back to the point I was talking about where the actual texture of the block itself doesn't really matter. The color is the main important thing, in my opinion. The upper section of the build is going to be this orange color, the very bright, vibrant orange, and that's going to be this section right here. And then the roof especially, and the other accent colors like these rail things, whatever these are called, overhangs, I can't remember the word, but anyway, those are going to be this blue color, and these are actually complementary colors on the color wheel. I'll show you again. You can see how they're on opposite sides from each other right there, so they contrast just about as well as any color that you could possibly find. It's always a safe bet to go with colors that are directly across from each other on the wheel. Since the build is already constructed, we can just take this and look at what I've already done over here. So you can see once again that this tan color palette is used here on the bottom. And again, very similar to this build, it's just built up in a gradient from my darkest tan colors, which would be the birch, up to the brightest, which is the endstone. I also used some pink terracotta, which is very similar to this terracotta on this build as just an accent color to help this kind of stand out a little bit and just make this wall a little bit more interesting. The techniques for this wall are extremely similar to the one I did on the Grayscale wall. The main difference with this build is, of course, these sections up here at the top and the accent colors being very intentionally contrasting warm and cool colors like I was talking about before. The main takeaway of this build would be, of course, that the contrasting colors really help a build pop, and they help these details pop a lot. Over on this build, you can kind of see that while these details like the accent colors do stand out, it's all a bit more toned back, which makes the build as a whole more comparable. Like the stone wall down here is almost just as interesting as anything else on the build, whereas over here, it's really hard to not look at these big bright orange and blue sections that use these big contrasting colors. So using a warm and cool color palette is obviously a way to make a build's colors look good together, and using big contrasting colors like opposites on a color wheel, for example, is a great way to make a build stand out. If you want a particular build to stand out amongst other builds, then using big contrasting colors like that is a great way to draw the eye. Okay, let's move on to this build over here and talk about this thing. So for the last build today, I really want to just go super overboard and exaggerated on the gradient aspect of builds, and I've kind of alluded to this a few times in builds before. As you can see, very subtle gradients from dark to light or whatever that I've been implementing, and so I really just want to go super overboard on the gradient side of things with this build. Slight spoilers for my Forever World series. If you aren't watching that, I also do Minecraft Survival Let's Play as in Forever World, and this is going to be a build I put up maybe in the next episode, I hope, if I have time. So anyway, I just want to highlight the gradient on this build. You can see how much more exaggerated it is in comparison to anything we've done today, and gradients are a really interesting way to add a lot of different colors to a build in kind of a really smooth and subtle way almost. While it's not subtle the colors I'm using, it's kind of subtle how they're implemented in a weird way, if that makes sense. They also just kind of look cool. I like doing gradients. I do them a lot, but especially ones with big color changes. They just look cool, and you know, that's kind of what's important when you're building. So for this gradient here, I chose colors that are kind of interesting, as you can see. If you want to build a gradient out of different colors, and you're not just going to use dark gray and light gray or dark tan and light tan, if you want to like go between two different colors or use a more obscure color like yellow, for example, the best way to do that is to just pick out two blocks, one that you want to start at and one that you want to end at, and try and fill out the space in between. So I know I want one gradient on the bottom of the build, which will be this area right here, this stone bit, to go from a dark purple to blue, like this. What I did from there is I would just scroll through the menu and try and find blocks that worked well in between them to kind of fill out the gradient. And this just involves a lot of trial and error. As you can see, the gradient isn't necessarily particularly smooth, but the further away you get and maybe the more you squint, the more smooth that the gradient will look. This color palette is not one that has a lot of options in the crafting menu. There's not a lot of options for purple, blue, or yellow blocks. Like, there's a lot of options for brown and gray, but not so many options for blue. And so when you're working with colors that are a bit more obscure as far as how many options there are in Minecraft blocks, the gradient might not be as smooth as you want it to be, but that's okay because when you put it together and when you mix it up a little randomly in the texturing like we've done before on these builds, it still will look pretty smooth. So just make it as smooth as possible. Not every gradient's going to be able to look as smooth as this one. Most of them won't be, so don't try too hard to make the gradient smooth or you will not be able to do it. Obviously, the roof is going to remain black, and I'm going to be using this kind of orange to yellow gradient up on this top upper section right here. This build is obviously going to be super, super vibrant, and it's also going to be contrasting. As you can see, I'm using purple and yellow. And purple and yellow are, again, as you can see on the color wheel, complementary colors. They are complete opposites from each other, and so the most contrasting you can get. And I'm also going to be using blue and orange, which, once again, if you look at the wheel, they are completely opposite complementary colors. So again, a lot of contrast is going to be used in this build. Using gradients is a good way to use other techniques we've done to a very extreme degree, like complementary colors. Instead of having 2 complementary colors, now I have 4, which is going to make the build pop even more than this one does right here. So if we take a look at the build and how I implemented it, you can see that while the gradient, again, isn't particularly smooth, when you mix up the blocks randomly with a little bit of texturing, it does not look that bad. This building also does a good job, again, with contrasting colors, but kind of in a more subtle way almost than this build because they're not necessarily right next to each other. A few things to note about this build outside of what I've already said. Number one, as you can see, accent colors on this build, because there's already so much color from the gradients, the accent colors are basically just the same colors we have in other places on the build. You can see the windows, I'm using blue, which are complementary to yellow, and of course there's blue right here, and of course for the overhang I'm using yellow, which you can find literally right above it. And the other details of the build are all just made out of one kind of wood. You can see how I mixed up the different wood types on other builds with the intention of adding variety, but on a build that has so much variety and color just on the walls, adding just one kind of wood to make it look as consistent as possible actually helps the details stand out much more than if I used multiple kinds of wood. So simplifying the color of the accents on builds that use a lot of color like this gradient actually will help them stand out more. It's kind of like a reverse accent color. The other thing to note is that when you're using gradients, a lot of times there aren't other kinds of variations of blocks of the kind you want to use. So what I mean is, like, for example, this terracotta block does not have a wall variant, and there's no purple wall variant like in this wooden color either. So you can see I've used stone, like this is tough and mud brick walls right here. I forgot the names of both of those. And you can tell that they're different colors, but they're kind of like close enough to where if you step back far enough, you might not notice it. Once again, the roof remains black, mostly because I just didn't want to make the roof also colorful. Kind of similar to the reverse accents we have. The more color I add to the roof, the more it's just not going to stand out at all. And so in order for it to stand out, I actually kind of intentionally just left it bland, because that blandness stands out against the absolute ridiculous amount of vibrance and color and texture we have on this build right here. Kind of the same reason I also left the plants just green, because if I added really colorful flowers like I did in these two, it might just detract from the color of the walls. However, that is all the strategies for coloring that I'm going to go over today. Let me know in the comments if there's any confusion about the video that you have. I will clarify, I will get back to you, I will comment. Let me know if you have any other questions, and I'll answer in a comment, or maybe even make an own designated video that will go later in the series about your questions. So please, if you have questions, leave them. Check out my Forever World. It's also going to be, it's probably on the screen right now. I have a playlist for my Forever World and a playlist for this series right here. If you want to go back and watch any of the other building guide videos, I talk about other tips. I have 2 out right now. So if you want to watch those, if you want to learn to be a better builder, then watch those. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching. I apologize for my OBS technical problems, and I will see you all in the next video.